contestants aware that the disqualifying times are 4:30 to 7:30. Are we ready? Yeah.
Mr. Contest Chair, I move to accept Vivian Harte's, to have Vivian Harte represent us in the international contest, even if her time is over.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second. Okay. So, let's make it official. All those in favor of Vivian Harte representing Saguaro Toastmasters at the C2 area contest, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. All right, the motion passes. Vivian Harte will represent us at the C2 area contest. Congratulations. But that's not all. Let's hear her speech. Vivian Harte, the greatest generation. The greatest generation. Vivian Harte.
Tom Brokaw wrote a book called The Greatest Generation. And in that book, he talked about the generation that fought World War II. But I disagree. I believe the greatest generation is the 60s generation. And I'm going to tell you why using 3 of the phrases that were popular in the 60s. The first phrase is, make love, not war. Now we know what the not war means. That meant at the time, not the Vietnam War. Guys were going and fighting in the war. They were dying for a war that they didn't even know why they were dying. So the demonstrations happened, and people began to not support the war because, number one, we were losing the war, but also because of those demonstrations. That generation was very strong in stopping that war. Make love. Now, it just so happened that the young unmarried women were the very first generation to have the pill. And that generation actually did make a lot of love. But there's a deeper understanding of the 60s generation and how they loved people. The 60s generation stood for equality. The oldest members of the group, born in 1946 and 47, 20 years later, went from the colleges in the north down to the south to march with the black people for equal rights. And then later they created the women's liberation movement. And later they created the gay rights movement. The only generation with so much love in their hearts that they created more movements of equality than any other generation. Make love, not war. The second phrase is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Now, I already talked about the sex part. The drugs part is related to creativity. We have Steve Jobs, who invented Apple computers. We have the PC, but not only the technology, but whole new concepts were created by that generation. Alternative medicine, organic foods, new ways of doing therapy for psychology, simple living, and then also expanding certain ideas that were already there, like the environmental movement. All of those were things that that generation put energy into. And of course, rock and roll. Now that generation used their music to share what the ideas were that they had. Here's a little bit from a song by Steppenwolf, an anti-war song. America, where are you now? Don't you care about your sons and daughters? Don't you know that we need you now? We can't fight alone against the monster. Here's a song by Helen Reddy for the Women's Liberation Movement. Some of you may remember this. I am woman, hear me roar, in numbers too big to ignore. And I know too much to go back and pretend. sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Now the third phrase has only 2 letters, O and M, Om. It's the name of spirit in the Hindu religion. So what happened? The Beatles in the late 60s go to India and study with the Maharishi. And they come back to the West and they share the consciousness of Eastern religion. And the 60s generation sucked it up. They loved it. That's why we have yoga, meditation in our society today. So what that generation did was something no other generation has ever done in this society. They married the 2 concepts of the East and the West. The concept of the East, of the divinity within, and the concept of the West, which is the love that Jesus taught. And out of that came the concept of the family of humanity. We are here to help each other thrive and to relate to each other as brothers and sisters. And no one said that better or sang that better than John Lennon. Imagine. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one. I congratulate the 60s generation for sharing all of these ideas and being the greatest generation. Mr. Toastmaster.